Hello again, my friends, my long-lost friends. It's been a while. Welcome back to All Prophecy Fulfilled. Man, I think it's been like 2 or 3 months or something like that. Like I've said before, summertime is my crazy busy time. I just don't seem to have the time or the energy really to cobble together some lessons for you on a regular basis. But you know what? Summer's coming to a close, and I've got some things on my mind that I need just to put out there for you, and I want you to see and hear and think about. So hopefully I will be able to put some lessons out on a bit more regularity. So I'm going to just be honest here. Here we are, lesson 55 of the last days biblically defined, and I am so ready just to wrap up this series. I really am. Why would I say that? Well, I feel as though I've already accomplished that which I set out to do. I've already demonstrated what I've set out to demonstrate. What did I want to do? Well, I simply wanted to define the last days biblically. Well, how did we do that? What did we do? Well, we started way back in Genesis from the very beginning, and we looked at 2 important key words, Hebrew words, akarith and case. Now, those are that occurs like 100, those 2 words combined occur in the Old Testament like 167 times, something like that. And we looked at the eschatological occurrences of those, because those are the 2 Hebrew words in which we see phrases such as last, latter, latter end, latter times, latter days, last days, end, the end, time of the end of days, and so on and so forth. So we looked at all of those from the very beginning, and we looked at those in their context, okay? And, if I could just give myself a little pat on the back here, if you don't mind. Man, you can look around for video series, or you can look around for articles or studies or essays or whatever, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think you're going to find a more meticulous, a more systematic, a more thorough approach than the way we've approached this. Like I said, this has been ongoing for almost a couple years now. So here is what we have found, okay, over the course of this study. What have we consistently found as we've continued down this road using this approach? Well, here's what we found. There is not one single reference to an end or a last days that is not contextually tied to Old Covenant Israel's end under law and under that first covenant. That's the only eschatological end that Scripture speaks of. There's not a single end that extends beyond the end of Israel's age under law, which ended with the destruction of the temple, their temple, in 70 AD. There is no end of the world mentioned. There is no end of planet Earth. There's no mention of the end of all humanity. The only last days of any world, quote unquote, that the prophet spoke of, Israel's prophet spoke of, are the last days of Israel's first covenant world. That's it. So then we came to the New Testament, right? And basically, I asked a very simple but a very important question. Why would the New Testament writers, why would they suddenly, out of the blue, why would they begin speaking of and teaching a different end, another last days that their prophets, Israel's prophets, spoke of? Think about that. Why would they suddenly change gears in the New Testament and begin teaching the last days of all humanity or something like that? Right? A worldwide earth-ending event that was totally and contextually detached from the only end spoken of from the rest of the Scriptures. Why would they do that? They would not. Hello, right? Makes sense. Okay, so that's what we've been doing in the New Testament, is we've been looking at the Greek equivalents to those Hebrew words, or the Hebrew equivalents, which would be telos, and eschatos in a couple other variations. And that's what we've been doing in the New Testament. And we have found that the New Testament writers are in complete, consistent harmony with the prophets. Israel's prophets. It's kind of like a funnel. Got myself a funnel here. You know, think about it. Piece by piece, passage by passage, acareth after acareth, after case, we have continued to kind of add into the evidence right here, and we're going to see what comes out this other end. So we're adding in here, and we're going to have a conclusion that comes out at this end. And piece by piece, we've continued to put into this funnel, and we have seen over and over and over again one consistent message by the prophets. You might recall way back beginning in Genesis 49, right? That's kind of where we began. We see the first occurrence of Acareth. And from the beginning, the last days in that particular passage is the last days of the sons of Jacob, right? Remember that? Which is tantamount to saying it's the last days of Israel's. It's the tribes of Jacob which became Israel. From the beginning, that was the latter days in view, and that just remained consistent all the way through the story. Later on, actually, I backed up to Genesis 4:3, because that was actually the first occurrence of Cates, and that's where we saw the story of Cain and Abel, and through that, that gave us a picture of Israel's end of days. There's your Cates right there. Passage after passage after passage reveals the same last days and the same end. Israel's end. Their end is a people under law. The ending of that covenant nation, really. That's it. Okay? And then we get to the end of the Old Testament right here. This is the New Testament right here. This is the Old Testament, passage by passage. And you get to this narrow end here. This here is the New Testament. This is the last days. This is when I think Jesus said, everybody was pressing into the kingdom right here. Everybody's pressing into the kingdom here. This is the New Testament. This is the last days. This really was the point of Israel's story, to get to this point, their journey under law, to get to the end here when the curse and the death of the law would be overcome, right? This is where, and this is when Israel's new heaven and earth, right, would arrive. This new kingdom apart from the death and the curse of the law, which began right here. So, okay, then something happened along the way. You might have noticed that by the end of the Old Testament, as we came, close to the New Testament, this series really began to naturally diverge, I think, really into two main thoughts. Okay, you had the last days, and along with that, we had a very controversial topic that has upset a lot of you: Israel only. Last days, Israel only. Well, you know what? I'm here to tell you those are two sides of the same coin. Let me explain. Now, I say it's a kind of a natural divergence, or it's a natural progression, because it became oh so clear to me that the only last days in Scripture belonged to Israel only. See what I did there? We began to see how everything promised and prophesied came to fulfillment that was promised to Israel. And those promises were coming to fruition in the New Testament. Okay, you might recall I did some lessons at the very end of the New Testament on Israel's scattering and gathering, or regathering, scattering and gathering. And I made the point of how that Old Testament prophetic thing was the basic overall trajectory of Israel's story, of the entire biblical story, really. That which was predicted by Moses had played out and was playing out to its end, or as Moses would put it, to their latter end. Deuteronomy 32, okay? Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 28 through 32 comes to mind, and there's many others, where Moses basically, he gave the entire trajectory of Israel's story all the way to their latter end. Okay, in a very simple summary goes something like this. You're going to enter the land. You're going to be scattered. You're going to be cut off. You're going to even be divorced from Yahweh. You're going to be carried away into idolatry, into paganism. You will be scattered into the nations. You will become the nations. You will become Gentile, if you will. Gentile in the flesh. Okay? But in the last days, Israel, you will be brought back to Yahweh, married again through a new covenant. There is your story. There's your history. There is your story of redemption right there. And I began to notice, hey, this is the story right here. This is the completed story. And it doesn't include you or me. Okay, we got some problems here, don't we? Because this is an ancient story of a covenant creation between Yahweh and his ancient people, or ancient covenant people. It was their redemption that was in view. And when I saw things like Jesus saying that he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and I knew from many Old Testament passages, or we knew, that only Israel was God's sheep throughout the story, and I thought, that's interesting, and I know you thought that too. And when Jesus told his disciples that he was going to make them fishers of men, and I knew, and I think you knew, that was in alignment with Moses, and that was in alignment with Jeremiah, how he predicted a time when God would send fishermen to fish out his scattered people out from among the nations. And I see that fulfillment in Revelation, them coming out of the nations. And I begin to see the big picture here so much clearer than I had, and I think you were seeing it too. So what am I saying? I'm saying that I believe a consistent hermeneutic, the very same approach that we've been taking, over the course of 55 lessons here, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to yield a fulfilled conclusion. In other words, I think it's going to produce a full preterist position or a conclusion. And not only that, I contend a consistent hermeneutic through the fulfilled lens, through the full preterist lens, is going to, number two, it's going to bring one to the inevitable conclusion that the ancient Hebrew scriptures tell the covenant and redemptive story of Israel only. And I get it, I know how, and I know why this is upsetting for a lot of you. And as I continue down this road that I think consistency has brought us to, I think the responses, man, I tell you what, they have grown more and more concerned in their tone, and then many of the responses to my lessons have been just outright antagonistic, and that's fine, I get it. People were screaming, you know what, you make the Bible irrelevant. You're missing the big picture of God's plan for all humanity, you and me. What about us? How does this apply? And people are just upset. Now look, I want you to believe me, I've heard, and I totally understand the arguments against this particular position many have labeled Israel only. I get it. For example, many people will say, you know what, number one, Ryan, the new covenant was, and it is, open for all humanity going forward from the time of Christ going forward. They'll say, number two, the New Jerusalem and its gates, you know what, those are always open. So that means people continue to come in. That means it's not really fulfilled yet in a way. And Ryan, Isaiah does say, the increase of his government, there is no end. So this thing is an ongrowing kingdom, and that's you and me. I get that. The people will say, number three, the old covenant allowed proselytes, it allowed pagans, it allowed Gentiles into the covenant. They could be as native born, right? So that must be true, or that must hold true for the new as well. Well, I understand that argument. And number 4, some people say, you know what? The new covenant emphasized Gentile inclusion, right? There is no Jew, there is no Gentile, right? And then that's us, because in fact, Paul's ministry was for the Gentiles, right? And that would mean not just Gentiles then, but Gentiles now. That's you and me, people who are outside of that covenant. So, I get it. But you know what? I have very sound, very thorough scriptural responses to each of these arguments, and I'm gonna have to spend some more time on these, and I will. And I'll probably do some video lessons on them, either in this series as I'm wrapping up, or maybe I'll make a new series out of it or something. Okay, but I do have scriptural responses for these arguments, because I too initially thought those things as well. But these arguments that I too once had, I think they're based on presupposition or assumption or false logic, or they're simply believed because that's what we've been told from the beginning, from Sunday school upward. That's simply what we've been taught, okay? But you know what? I don't believe these arguments can be substantiated thoroughly, adequately with Scripture, okay? Now, I've hit on these things during this series, but I need to dedicate an entire lesson on it, and I can demonstrate how the new covenant, for example, was intended only for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I can explain why. I can explain what it means, for the gates of Israel's new Jerusalem to never be closed. I can explain what that means. And it doesn't have anything to do with people entering. Okay? I can thoroughly explain how the Gentiles in view in Scripture from the very beginning are Gentile Israelites. Gentiles is actually, that's just a horrible, misleading translation, okay? It's basically a made-up word is what it is. Gentiles means nations, and the only group of people, the only set of people who were predicted to be scattered into the nations, the goyim, the ethnos, the only ones that would be scattered into the nations, become part of the nations, and they would be brought back, redemption, from the nations, were indeed Israelites. They were the only ones prophesied and promised to do so. And it was only these Gentiles, those in the nations, the lost sheep Israelites out of those nations, that Paul was focused on in his ministry and in all his letters. I can demonstrate that, and I will. Now, in my opinion, here's really the main problem with the arguments that most use against Israel only. And you know what? I get it, because I too was guilty of this, okay? So here's the main problem. Like I said, I think there's so much assumption, so much presupposition, and I think there's always a commitment to a dearly held paradigm we just don't want to let go to. And I think that leads to a natural assumption of, and the acceptance of, without really looking into it, the misuse and the misappropriation of Hebrew and Greek language. Let me explain that. Again, the misuse and the misappropriation of Hebrew and Greek language. Okay, what do I mean by that? The Bible is filled with words and terms and phrases and concepts that had a very specific meaning and a very specific intention to that immediate audience, and even just to that culture, that ancient culture at large, okay? Terms, phrases, words that really should be contextually confined and understood within the covenant context of the Hebrew story itself, right? Does that make sense? We have to confine all these biblical terms to within the story itself. But for 2,000 years plus, those words, those biblical phrases, the concepts, they have been stretched and molded and bent and misapplied to those to whom it was never intended to apply to, namely you and me. That's you and me, okay? The Bible is an ancient text that uses words and phrases that must be contextually confined to the text and the story itself. In other words, everything, and I mean everything, is contextually confined to Israel and her covenant world under law. That's the story, okay? For example, here we go. Let me give you something you can think about here. People say that we, all humanity, all humans, everybody, everywhere, all times, are dead in sins. Dead in sins, dead in trespass. And what do they cite? Well, usually they cite Ephesians chapter 2. Now, this has become a major, orthodox evangelical doctrine that must be accepted by golly. How can you become a Christian unless you first recognize your sinful, pathetic, dead in sins status, right? Well, you can't. But no. Here's the truth. Here is the truth. Here is the biblical truth. See, I try to separate and distinguish between biblical fact and Christian fantasy. Hey, there's my Christianity Newsflash slogan right there. Biblical fact, Christian fantasy. There's a world of difference. Okay, so here's the truth. Only those under law and the first covenant were dead in sins. That was Israel. Dead in sins and trespass is a covenant term. It's covenant language. It's a covenant concept. Paul wrote that in light and in context to scattered Israelites who'd been rendered dead in their sins. That's what the law did. The law killed, right? It was the ministry. It was the condemnation of death. Paul said, I was alive once, but what happened? Well, the law entered in, bam, it killed him. Only Israel, Psalm 147, had the law, or was given Yahweh's law. The law killed. Only those under law and that first covenant could be dead in their sins, okay? That's just the biblical fact. We have to confine dead in sins to the story, to the context, the way that it was intended to be used by Paul. Okay, folks, that is why, if you think about it, just think with me for a second, that is why only those associated with or under that first covenant, that is why they needed a new covenant. You don't need a new covenant. You never did. They needed a new covenant that brought life. Why? Because they were under the ministry in the covenant that brought death. They needed life. Do you see how that works? Okay. Speaking of Ephesians, Paul, he was speaking to the Ephesians, and he mentioned that they were being brought back to God from afar, or from far off. Remember that, Ephesians chapter 2, okay? Well, again, who are the only group of people that were scattered to the four corners of the earth, but they were promised to be they were promised to be made far off, but they were also promised to be eventually gathered. Well, again, according to Isaiah and all the other prophets, that only was Israelites. And that's why Paul is quoting Isaiah in Ephesians chapter 2. Okay, these Ephesians were scattered Israelites, or they were, however they got there, they had an association. They had been made dead under that first covenant, and they were being brought back. They were part of the group that was being brought back from far off or afar, okay? So here's my point, okay? The truth is, the same goes. I've mentioned dead in sins and, far off and stuff like that. The same goes for so many other terms that we have just lifted right out of Israel's stories, and we have just applied it to all humanity when that was never the intention of Scripture, never the intention of the author. That's not how the audience would have taken it. Words and phrases that have become everyday language for us, like redemption, salvation, heaven, hell, heaven and earth maybe. All those need to be understood in their covenant context, and they really should only be applied to those to whom it pertained to, those who were a part of the story. So redemption, everyday language for us, right? Oh, we need to be redeemed. Wait a minute, redeemed? According to the Bible, according to the Scriptures, you only need to be redeemed and reconciled back to God if you are first alienated from God. If there is a division that later on requires a redemption, that requires a reconciliation. Well, what was it that divided these particular people in the story from God? It was the law. It was the curse of the law. Their sins under law had separated from their God. They needed redemption. So there's only one group of people needing redemption in this story, Israel. How about salvation? Salvation from what? From hell? No. From the death and the curse of the law. That's what salvation basically is in Scripture, okay? I mentioned the curse. Everybody says, oh, you're under a curse. Well, no, that's because we've made the curse something it is not. The curse is not some physical curse on all humanity. According to Scriptures, it's the curse of the law. Galatians 3, okay? And according to, again, Psalm 147 and others, only Israel had God's law. Only Israel was under the curse. Only Israel was subject to the death and the curse. Not a physical death, but death brought by law. So when we came to the New Testament, you probably noticed that I emphasize, repeatedly, these very clear and explicit passages that for some reason I pretty much ignored my entire Christian life, and you probably did too. For example, Hebrews 9:15, he is a mediator of a new covenant by means of death for the redemption, hey, there's your redemption, of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So look, again, this clearly tells us that redemption was for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. Now people say, well, that doesn't mean it doesn't include us. Well, this particular verse is in total and complete alignment, and it's consistent with what all the prophets before have spoken, and they have spoken of nothing other than Israel's transgressions, Israel's covenant, Israel's salvation, and Israel's redemption. How about Galatians 4 and 5? When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Okay, again, a very, very clear verse that tells us that redemption was for those under the law. And so was the adoption. We can go to Romans 9, which tells us that. Paul speaks of his countrymen according to the flesh. Well, who are those? Well, those are Israelites to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, right? So when I cite verses like, Hebrews 9, Galatians 4, Romans 9, okay, am I citing those verses void of context or apart from the rest of Scripture? Because people say, you can't just cite like 3 verses and expect me to answer a question based on those 3. You need the entirety of Scripture. So they refuse. I'll ask them a question like, okay, who did redemption pertain to according to this verse? And they won't answer it because they know the answer, but they'll say, well, you know what? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, no, actually, these passages right here, I think these are texts that we should tether to because they are foundational reiterations, that's right, reiterations of what all the prophets have already said time and time again. These scriptures here, these verses, these are confirming what the old prophets have said, okay? They're the concluding sentiments by Paul, for example, of where this story of Israel, of their covenant and their law, where it's all been heading to all along. And Paul is confirming that, okay? Israel's redemption, Israel's salvation, Israel's adoption, Israel's inheritance. And that's why Paul says these things. He doesn't say these things so we can kind of sweep it under the carpet and like we didn't see it. No, they're confirming the entirety of the story. Okay, Israel's story. I'm starting to ramble a little bit here, so I'm going to stop right now. I wanted to check in with you guys, let you know, hey, I'm still alive. Hope you are too. I'm going to wrap up this series because I feel like the point has been made, and I've got a lot of other things that I got on my mind. I got some Christianity news flashes to do. Again, I've got some of the stuff that we talked about today, these arguments that a lot of anti-IOers are throwing out there. I have some responses for those. Not sure exactly how long this particular series will continue. Again, it's coming to a close. I just wanted to check in, give you the review, let you know where I'm at. And man, I appreciate you joining me here. And we got more coming up. Try to get on a roll here, and we'll get going. So, hey, good seeing you again. See you next round. Adios.